She was standing in the dark, just off stage, and nobody in that crowd of 50,000 people knew her name. That was June 1967, the Monterey Pop Festival. California was warm and buzzing with something that felt like the edge of history, the kind of night that seemed to know, even as it was happening, that it would be remembered. The air smelled of grass and salt wind blowing in off the Pacific, and from the wings of that outdoor stage, Janis Joplin could hear the crowd already humming with the particular anticipation of people who have gathered for something and are not yet sure exactly what it will be. She was 24 years old. She had a bottle in one hand and a set list crumpled in the other. Her hair was wild and loose, her blouse fringed and beaded, and her eyes held something that the people out in that field would not fully understand until she opened her mouth, something between hunger and terror, between joy and a grief so old it had stopped having a specific name and had simply become part of the way she breathed. In a few minutes everything would change, not just for her, for the shape of American music itself, for what people believed a voice could do and what a woman could be on a stage in front of the world. But standing there in the dark, Janis Joplin had no way of knowing that. What she knew was the fear. The particular, specific, bone-deep fear of a woman who had spent most of her life being told she was too much, too loud, too raw, too strange, too emotional, too everything, and who had chosen, against every warning and every wound, to walk out there and be all of those things anyway, without apology and without a safety net, what the audience would feel in the next. 40 minutes was power. What she was carrying into it was something far more complicated than that. And the distance between those two things, between what the crowd would receive and what it had actually cost her to give, is where the real story lives. To understand what happened at Monterey, you have to go back to a place that was almost perfectly designed to produce someone like Janis Joplin, and then spend the next decade making her feel like she had no place in it. Port Arthur, Texas. A refinery town on the Gulf Coast, flat and gray and perpetually smelling of industry. Conformity wasn't a social preference there, it was a survival strategy. The lines were drawn early and enforced with the particular certainty of communities that have agreed on exactly how things should be and find deviation unsettling. Janis was born on January 19, 1943, the eldest child of Dorothy and Seth Joplin. Her father was a thoughtful, quietly intellectual man who read philosophy and asked questions about the universe that didn't have clean answers. Something of that restless interior life passed into his daughter almost immediately. By the time she was in grade school, it was clear that she processed the world differently, more intensely, more openly, and because intensity and openness were not rewarded in Port Arthur, more painfully. She read Steinbeck and Kerouac before most of her classmates had found the library. She painted. She thought about things too hard and said what she was thinking in rooms where silence was the expectation. She had opinions about art and music at an age when the social project around her was entirely focused on fitting in, and fitting in was the one thing Janis Joplin seemed constitutionally unable to do. The cruelty that greeted her was swift, social, and sustained. Adolescence for Janis was not a gentle transition. She was mocked for her appearance, excluded from the circles that defined status, dismissed by the boys she wanted to notice her, and targeted by the girls she wanted to befriend. Port Arthur decided early that she was an outsider, and it reminded her of that decision regularly. The message was consistent: you are too much, and what you are should be corrected. But here is what Port Arthur could not have understood. The wound it was inflicting would one day become the voice that moved millions. The very intensity that made her unacceptable in that town was the exact quality that would make her irreplaceable everywhere else. That was not consolation to a teenager absorbing rejection in a place that punished. Difference, what rescued her in the most literal sense was music, specifically the blues, the raw, emotionally unguarded music of Bessie Smith and Lead Belly and Big Mama Thornton, artists who sang as though the only thing that mattered was the truth of what they were feeling in that exact moment. Not a managed version of the feeling itself, unmediated, given completely. For Janis, hearing Bessie Smith for the first time was not a musical discovery, it was recognition. Someone somewhere had felt this much and had turned it into sound rather than silence. If that transformation was possible, if the interior could become exterior, if pain could become beauty, then maybe the intensity she'd been told was her flaw was actually the material. She began to sing, not to perform, not yet, but to release, her voice even. Then was not what anyone around her expected. It was rough and vast, deeply female in a way that had nothing to do with prettiness. It bent notes where trained singers held them straight. It cracked where others would have smoothed, and in those cracks something essential lived. She left Port Arthur for the first time at 17, then came back, left again and again, each departure a small act of self-preservation, each return a reminder of why leaving had felt necessary. San Francisco in the mid-1960s was a city in the middle of reinventing itself. By the time Janice arrived more permanently in 1966, it was filling with people who had made similar journeys, artists, musicians, drifters, people for whom the conventional path had felt like a slow disappearance. San Francisco in 1966 was where those people were converging, and it had the energy that comes from a concentration of individuals who have all decided to stop pretending. For a young woman from Port Arthur who had spent a decade being told she was too much, it was the first place that seemed to register her at the right volume. Here, the intensity was not a flaw, it was currency. She had been building a small reputation in the folk and blues clubs since her arrival, the specific, urgent word of mouth of music communities. You have to come and hear this woman, I don't know how to describe it, just come and listen. But the years before 1966 had been difficult in ways she rarely discussed publicly. Financially precarious, emotionally uncertain, marked by the exhaustion of being talented in a world not yet organized around recognizing that talent. What changed everything was a band. Big Brother and the holding company were already working the San Francisco circuit when a mutual acquaintance arranged an introduction. The band needed a singer. They had no idea what they were about to encounter. The first rehearsal became something close to legend. The band began to play and Janice opened her mouth and the room changed, the way air changes before a storm arrives. Sam Andrew on guitar looked across at Peter Albin on bass. The expression on their faces said everything. We are going to have to rethink what we thought we were doing. She didn't sing at the music, she sang into it. She found the emotional center of whatever the band was building and inhabited it completely, with a commitment that felt less like performance and more like possession. By the end of that first session, the only question was how quickly they could all get back into the room together and feel that thing again. But beneath that power, beneath the thing that had changed the atmosphere of that rehearsal space, something else was present. Something none of them could see yet, because it lived not in the performance but in the spaces between performances, in the rooms that were quiet after the music stopped. The San Francisco scene in 1966 and 1967 was generating heat at a speed the broader music industry was only beginning to register. Big Brother and the holding company were part of that current, playing the Fillmore and the Avalon Ballroom, building a following that grew by the show. And Janis Joplin was its center of gravity, not its figurehead, but its actual center, the point around which the band's energy organized itself and from which it radiated into the room. She commanded a stage in a way that very few performers have ever quite matched. The key was the absence of distance. There was no gap between her and the music. When she sang about pain, the pain was not represented, it was present in the room. When she sang about longing, the longing was audible in every breath. Audiences felt it in their bodies before they understood it with their minds. Word spread from show to show. People came once and came back. They brought others. The following grew from dozens to hundreds, and the reputation traveled up the coast and across the country through everyone who moved between the music scenes of the mid-60s. The people who knew her in those years describe a woman who was warmer off stage than most people expected. Funny, sharp, generous, someone who laughed easily and cared deeply about the people around her. But they also describe the growing gap between who she actually was and what the audience was beginning to project onto her: liberation, pure freedom, someone who had figured out what everyone else was still trying to solve. She hadn't figured it out. She was still in the middle of it like everyone else. The symbol the world was building around her required her to be only the most visible part of herself always, and to keep the rest out of view. She spoke about loneliness in ways that surprised people who expected the onstage energy to be the whole story. Not abstract loneliness, the specific loneliness of someone who gives everything in a room full of thousands and walks off stage still unreached. She wanted to be known, not famous, which is a different thing entirely, and in some ways its opposite. Known in the way that requires someone to hold the actual you, not just an image of you, but that was the part of the story running quietly underneath the rest of it. The louder parts were drawing all the attention, and the loudest thing of all was coming. The Monterey International Pop Music Festival was held over 3 days in June 1967, the first gathering of its kind at that scale. The lineup was extraordinary: Otis Redding, The Who, Jimi Hendrix, Simon and Garfunkel, Jefferson Airplane. These were names the 50,000 people in that field already knew. Big Brother and the Holding Company were not headliners. They were a San Francisco band with a circuit following. Most of the audience had come for other people. When the band's name appeared on the schedule, very few of the people reading it had a strong association with it. Nobody was prepared for what was about to happen. Backstage in the minutes before the set, Janice was quieter than usual. People who were there remember her differently than they expected, not the charged, magnetic figure who filled rooms with her presence, but someone smaller, more concentrated. She stood slightly apart from the activity around her, looking toward the stage without speaking. She had a bottle in her hand and a particular kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from everything being gathered inward, waiting. D.A. Pennebaker was there with his camera, filming for what would become the documentary record of the festival. This was not a club in the hate. This was something of a different order, and Janice knew it. The knowledge sat in her body the way significant moments do, not as excitement, but as a cellular awareness that something was about to happen that could not be taken back. What she was doing in those minutes was gathering, pulling inward. Everything she was about to spend, 24 years of Port Arthur, of Bessie Smith, of every room that had said she didn't belong, of every stage that had begun, slowly, cautiously, unmistakably, to say otherwise. She walked out onto the stage. The crowd received the band politely. The opening numbers were strong, but the audience was in listening mode rather than surrender mode. They were assessing, giving attention without yet giving themselves. And then Janice sang Ball and Chain. What happened in the next 4 minutes and 23 seconds has been described by everyone who was present in the language of physical experience, not metaphor, direct, bodily description. The sound entered people. The crowd stopped being a collection of individuals with separate responses and became something else entirely. She sang from a place where Bessie Smith's blues architecture and her own Port Arthur grief and all the accumulated longing of a life spent being told she didn't fit had merged into something new and ancient at the same time. The note she held in the bridge, long past the point where most singers would have released it, trembling with effort and something more than effort, seemed to contain everything the song was trying to say about wanting what cannot be had. In the wings, Cass Elliot was watching. The film captures her face in those moments, and what is on it is not appreciation. It is awe, the specific, involuntary awe of someone who knows exactly how difficult what they are watching is, and is watching it done at a level that makes difficulty invisible. The crowd's response at the end of the set was the kind that festival veterans say happens once or twice in a decade, not simply moved. 50,000 people who had arrived for other reasons, transformed by a woman most of them had not known about when the day began. Everything changed that night, but the story of what changed and what the change cost is more complicated than any single night of applause can contain. Within months of Monterey, Big Brother and the Holding Company signed with Columbia Records. Cheap Thrills reached #1 on the Billboard charts. Piece of My Heart became a radio staple. Janis Joplin's face appeared on magazine covers. She was famous, the kind of famous that arrives not gradually but suddenly, like a change in weather, and something she had not predicted began to happen almost immediately. The very qualities that made her voice devastating, the rawness, the complete emotional exposure, began to be consumed as spectacle. The audience wanted the performance of liberation. They wanted to watch someone be free in the way they were afraid to be themselves. And Janice gave it to them night after night because it was what she knew how to do. But the performances that looked like freedom were also a form of exposure. And exposure, sustained at that level without adequate protection or replenishment, has a cost that doesn't show up in reviews or chart positions. It shows up in the quieter moments. In the face of someone who has been completely visible for too long, this is where the story becomes human rather than mythological. She left Big Brother and the Holding Company in late 1968, a decision that was musically motivated but personally expensive. Those musicians had been her first real community, the people who had taken her in without requiring her to be smaller than she was. The Cosmic Blues band that followed was more professional, more polished. But polish is not always what a voice like hers required. Some of the rawness needed the particular friction of that earlier setting to do its work. The full tilt boogie band, assembled in 1970, felt different from the beginning. People who were present for the early sessions describe a Janis who seemed to be approaching the music with a new quality of attention, more settled, more deliberate, less concerned with the performance of intensity and more interested in the thing itself. The sessions for what would become the Pearl album were, by most accounts, some of the most productive of her career, genuinely joyful in the specific way that comes from knowing your craft has finally caught up with your ambition. The voice that had been raw and barely contained at Monterey had deepened into something that rawness alone cannot produce. There is a difference between a voice that is powerful because it has not yet learned caution, and a voice that is powerful because it has learned caution, understood what caution costs, and chosen, with full knowledge, to set it aside. The second kind of power is rarer. It was what Janis Joplin's voice was becoming in the autumn of 1970. To listen to Janis Joplin now, more than 5 decades after Monterey, is to encounter something that has not aged in the conventional sense. It still arrives, it still crosses whatever distance exists between the speaker and the listener and lands somewhere specific and interior and not easily described. Part of the answer is technical. The voice itself, its range and control, and the specific quality of its distortion, sitting at the intersection of blues, tradition, and rock power in a way very few singers before or since have found, is genuinely extraordinary as an instrument. Part of it is the musical intelligence, when to hold a note and when to release it, when to let the sound go ragged at the edges in the specific way that makes ragged edges carry more meaning than a smooth line would. But the deepest part of the answer is something technical description cannot fully reach. It has to do with commitment. With what it means to bring the whole of yourself, not a curated portion, but the actual whole, to an act of expression. There is a sound a voice makes when nothing is being withheld, not performed openness, but actual openness with all the risk that involves. That sound is what Janis Joplin produced, consistently, across a career that was shorter than it should have been and more complete than it had any right to be. She gave people something real to feel, even while searching for the same solace she offered them. That is not a contradiction. It is the definition of a particular kind of artistic courage, the willingness to offer what you are still in the process of finding. On October 4, 1970, Janis Joplin died at the Landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood, California. She was 27 years old. The Pearl sessions were nearly complete. The album was released the following January and reached #1, the first time one of her solo albums had achieved that position in her lifetime. Me and Bobby McGee, recorded just days before her death, became one of the defining songs of its era. The way she sang Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose, words written by Chris Christopherson, not by her, made them feel inseparable from her voice, as though they had been waiting for exactly that delivery to become what they were always trying to be. She did not know in that studio that it would be the last thing she recorded. What she knew was the song, its shape, its feeling, the thing it was reaching toward. And she sang it the way she sang everything, fully present, fully committed, as though the only moment that mattered was the one she was standing in. The legacy of Janis Joplin does not require maintenance. It does not need to be protected or periodically revived. It is simply available in the recordings, in the Monterey footage, in the testimonies of the people who were in rooms with her when she was alive. It waits for people to find it, and when they do, it does what it has always done. What people find varies by the person and the moment. Some find the power, the sheer force of the voice at its peak, the thing that stopped Cass Elliot in the wings and made 50,000 strangers feel like one body. Some find the vulnerability, the places in the recordings where the certainty wavers, where the human being behind the performance becomes briefly and crucially visible, and that visibility is the most affecting thing of all. And some find themselves, not because she was a mirror, but because she demonstrated with a clarity that has not faded across 5 decades, that the most extreme version of your feeling is not something to apologize for. It is the material. It is what the song is made from. She grew up in a town that told her she was too much. She became, by every measure that actually matters, exactly as much as she was. The gap between those two sentences contains the whole story, the rejection and the resilience, the loneliness and the voice that rose out of it. The girl in Port Arthur listening to Bessie Smith alone in her bedroom, and the woman standing in the dark at Monterey, 30 seconds before the world found out who she was. She walked out onto that stage in June 1967 carrying 24 years of being told she didn't belong. A bottle in her hand and a crumpled set list and a voice forged in exactly the kind of difficulty it was about to describe. She opened her mouth. And the world moved. It has not quite stopped moving since, not because the legend has been carefully maintained, but because what she left behind is not a monument. It is sound, still traveling, still arriving, still finding the people who need it. 50,000 people were in that field at Monterey on the afternoon she walked out there unknown, by the time she walked. Off stage, every single one of them knew her name. The rest of the world was only just beginning to understand why.